Month. Today's topic is Teaching Action and Justice, and we're so excited today for the group of panelists and for Frank Guridy, who will be moderating today. And I just wanted to open up today's talk by thanking the Department of History here at Columbia for their support in making this panel series happen. I wanted to thank the Committee on Inclusion and Diversity, and I will now, I should introduce myself. My name is Emma Scheinbaum. I'm the Communications and Development Director Coordinator at the Department of History here at Columbia. And I co-organized and initiated this panel series with Saida Islam, who I will now turn it over to.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Saida Islam, and I'm the Faculty Affairs Coordinator here at the History Department. It's our pleasure and honor to host our fifth webinar series in conversation with historians in honor of Black History Month. Our moderator today is going to be Frank Guridy, and he is an Associate Professor of History and African American and African Diaspora Studies here at Columbia University, and he will be moderating this event. So I will turn it over to Frank.
Thank you, Emma and Saida, and thank you all for attending this rendition of Conversation with Historians, which Emma and Saida are really responsible for, in response to the upheavals produced by the COVID-19 pandemic and by the protest inspired by the movement for Black Lives last year. I think it's added a wonderful kind of intellectual energy and thoughtfulness about the work that we do. So I'm really pleased to be back for this Black History Month edition. And I'm really happy to be here with some of my colleagues and also one of our graduate students, PhD students. And I want to introduce them quickly. They're pretty well known in their worlds and their bios that you can find on the internet, but I want to at least just recognize them here before we get into our conversation, which will kind of veer between big picture questions on Black History Month, why it matters now, and also talk about the particular contributions that our panelists are making through their scholarship, teaching, pedagogy, and advocacy and activism. So the first person I'd like to introduce is, I'm just going to introduce them really fast, and then we'll jump right into the conversation. Professor Sam Roberts, who's my colleague here in the Department of History and in African American and African Diaspora Studies. He was a former director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies. He writes, teaches, and lectures widely on African American urban history with an attention to medicine, public health, science, and technology. His first book, Infectious Fear, Politics, Disease, and the Health Effects of Segregation, was an exploration of the political economy of race and the modern political health state between the late 19th century and the early 20th century. He's currently researching and writing a book-length project on the United States troubled history of race and recovery, examining the social and political history of heroin addiction treatment during the 1950s, from the 1950s to the 1990s. Professor Roberts is one of our panelists. Our next panelist is my colleague, Mabel Wilson, who is Nancy George Rupp Professor of Architecture and the co-director of the Global Africa Lab at GSAP. She's also a professor in the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department. And she's the current director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies here at Columbia. She's an award-winning architect whose scholarly work makes visible and legible the ways that anti-Black racism shapes the built environment, along with the ways that Blackness creates spaces of imagination, refusal, and desire. She's the author of Begin with the Past, Building the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and then, of course, her 2012 book, Negro Building Black Americans in the World's Affairs and Museums. Our next panelist is Madison Ogletree, who is one of our star students in the PhD program. She's a second-year PhD student in the History Department. She came to Columbia after receiving her BA at Auburn University. She's interested in studying racism and the law in the 19th century U.S. South. Her research examines how free people of African descent navigated the laws governing slavery and freedom in rural areas of the South. Madison. And then last but not least is J.T. Roane, who is an alum of our PhD program, but that's not the only reason why he's great. He's an assistant professor of African and African American Studies in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. He received his PhD in history here from Columbia. He's a 2008 graduate of the Carter G. Woodson Institute at the University of Virginia. He's the former co-senior editor of Black Perspectives, the digital platform of the African American Intellectual History Society, which has been a wonderful energy produced by some really talented Black historians that have really made major contributions. His scholarly essays have appeared in Souls, The Review of Black Political Economy, and Current Research in Digital History. J.T. Roane. So we're going to have a conversation here that's going to get us to reflect on Black History Month, right? The origins of Black History Month is a story that should be well known, originating in the extraordinary efforts by Carter G. Woodson in the early 20th century, who helped push for the creation of a Negro History Week in a moment when the notion that Black people had no history was the dominant understanding of world history and US history at that time. Those efforts produced so many institutions that are still with us today, including ASALH, which has made important contributions and still does, I think, in the world of Black history. And then, of course, Negro History Week evolved into Black History Month, which we've been celebrating in one form or another since the 1970s. And, you know, as a historian of the Black experience, sometimes I have to admit, I've snickered when Black History Month comes along, because it's the moment when suddenly Black history becomes well known to a broader public among those who maybe don't think about the experience of people of African descent. And yet there's also like, it's a time when we get asked to make lectures, Black historians or specialists in Black history. And that is an honor and privilege, right? I don't mean to dismiss that. But there's something different about this context that I think animates this discussion for us today, right? In light of, as I said, the pandemic, in light of the movement for Black Lives that revived yet again after the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others last year. And in light of the resurgence of white supremacist politics, right, that we saw most vividly, of course, January 6th at the US Capitol, and the ongoing struggles against fascism, authoritarianism, and white supremacy, sexism, patriarchy, and other forms of phobia that plague our society. So there's an urgency about this discussion now that I think, at least this is my sense of our moment now, that makes this discussion important. A discussion that tends to revolve around contributions of Black people to history, to US history, but there's some more pressing matters in addition to those that we can talk about today. So with that in mind, I thought we could just start with a question for all the panelists. Like I said, some of these questions will be directed to all of the panelists. Some of them will be directed to individual panelists. Then we will take questions through that were already posed to us through Emma and Saida, and other questions that will come along through the Q&A. So my first question is a basic one, which is to ask the panelists to tell us about their research and teaching and how it has been affected by the events of the past year, the COVID-19 pandemic, the resurgence of the movement for Black Lives, and the revival of white supremacist politics, right? So I'm asking you to kind of think about, talk about your work, your teaching, or your advocacy, or your research, and how the conditions of the last year has changed it, if at all. And maybe we could start with Mabel.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Emma, Saida, for organizing this. And it's actually great to be with my historian colleagues to share my work, since my work is kind of all over the map in terms of how I work, but I do consider myself a cultural historian. I'm not an architectural, I'm a cultural historian who works on the built environment. And this year for me, certainly 2020 was going to be an interesting one, because as an architect, I had worked on the memorial to enslaved laborers in Charlottesville. So I was part of that design team. And that didn't open. But it was interesting that, in fact, when it opened, just sort of accidentally, when they took a fence down, the first event was a White Coats for Black Lives protest from the medical school. And the site was taken over by more than 500 people who knelt for 8 minutes and 48 seconds in remembrance of George Floyd. And to me, that was where, here is this historical site that remembered the enslaved community at UVA. JT and Sam will know, we didn't hear much about that community when we were students. That was linked, which is exactly what we wanted to say, that this is not over, and that we live in the wake of that. And that was a kind of important moment. I also co-edited a book, Race and Modern Architecture, which came out, and that there just has been no conversation about race and architecture. It's been very limited. So for us, that project was really important, and it came out in early June, and immediately the hardcover sold out within 3 weeks. And so that really snowballed a conversation, especially around how do we teach an anti-racist architectural history, design studio. And I'm currently, which is where I was today, working on a show called Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America at MoMA, and again, that was an important work to kind of link questions both of anti-Black racism in the built environment through things like redlining, but also to think about Black sociality and the kind of spaces that Black life in fact enacts. And all those three projects, even though they were completely transformed by COVID, became even more urgent precisely because of the ways in which we know COVID hit Black and brown communities, and then what happened with George Floyd and the resurgence of Black Lives Matters.
Yeah, no, I certainly want to circle back to this question of built environment, which has really reemerged in an interesting way as a result of what we've seen last year. I thought I'd go to JT next. JT, tell us about the work you've been doing and how, if it's changed as a result of what's happened over the last year.
Thank you, Frank, and thanks for the organizers, Saida and Emma. It's really an honor to be, back at history. In the history department at Columbia. I'm trying to work on finishing a book, Dark Agora's Insurgent Black Social Life and the Politics of Place in Philadelphia. And I think about the ways that migrants transported kind of post-emancipation, rural and milltown ways to the kind of metropolis, the industrial metropolis, and the ways that they're kind of, particularly plotting visions of autonomy around the land and waterscapes, the ways that migrants translate that in the city of homes, right? In this kind of endless geography of row houses. And I think about the ways that it gives shape, that trajectory gives shape to both the underground in Philadelphia and the set apart in Philadelphia. So the kind of religious and political set apart. I think movement between those worlds really animates Black 20th century politics in Philadelphia. Whether it's kind of a rigid, on a day-to-day kind of rigid distinction that communities make between these two very different worlds, almost inversions of one another. Often when you look at migrant narratives from the interwar and the post-war periods, there's a lot of crisscrossing, and that helps to shape how Black people understand the city and the future of the city. And I think most pointedly, since all of this has been going on, I've been working to finish a piece on Danetta Hill or Ya Asante Wa'ama, which will come out in Signs for summer 2021. And Danetta Hill is, it's really a kind of attempt at writing abolition from the bottom up, really thinking about what it means to take seriously a Black woman accused of being a sex worker and using drugs, who is not only convicted but also condemned to death for murdering two Johns in the early 1990s. And I think it's been a really difficult, like parsing through archives of court records and all of that to try to locate someone's life and their story or elements of it at least is difficult. But I think this moment of COVID and also particularly Black Lives Matter has drawn me to these kinds of histories of that don't always end in liberation, but that really do draw to the fore visions for, and by abolition, I mean, not only the kind of, I'm following with Ruthie Gilmore, not only the kind of end of this particular order, but also the expression of new orders. And so that, I think that it really has drawn me to that work, the COVID and all of that kind of, and Black Lives Matter moment.
Yeah, it's a really rich, interesting work. There's notion of abolition from the bottom up, and abolition, not just ending a current system, but also, trying to inaugurate a new one is really rich, and perhaps we can return to that. So Madison, you're a second-year PhD student here at Columbia. I assume that the events of the last year have added a kind of urgency, to your work on the 19th century. So tell us about the things you've been looking at and what you plan to look at and how they might have changed as a result of what's happened recently.
Right. Yeah. I just want to first start off by saying thank you all for inviting me to speak on this panel. I'm honored to be slated to speak with these incredible historians. But to answer the question, since I work on the 19th century South and I'm working toward a project on free communities of color in the plantation belt and rural regions of the slave South, I think this is the case for everyone, but during this stage of my research and my graduate career, COVID has most affected research by making travel to local archives impossible. And photocopies they get expensive really quickly. So I've been trying to rely heavily on digitized sources like legal sources, legislative acts, case laws, as well as newspapers and things that are easily accessible online. But I wouldn't say that my research topic has changed radically since this moment. If anything, it's just reaffirmed the reasons and experiences that brought me to study history in the first place. But I think this moment has definitely reinvigorated my concern for public history. And it's also deeply influenced my approach to pedagogy. Although I can't exactly say that what my teaching approach would have been before this moment, because I have only ever been a TA under these circumstances. But I think especially last semester, especially when election anxieties were high, I made sure to give my students room to voice concern over the current events, to try to have them connect them to class material, or I think even more importantly, give them the tools to historicize the world around them in the best ways that they can, by showing them how to be attentive to context, change over time, and contingency. I'm currently TAing for Professor Barbara Fields' History of the South class. So I have no doubts that students are going to have questions and comments about our current moment and trying to connect that to class material, especially as we inch closer to the Civil War and Reconstruction periods. And a lot of my students expressed that they chose to take the class because of our current moment. So I look forward to hearing what they have to say. And I think just making room for people to make those connections has been pretty important for me in terms of teaching.
Thanks, Madison. Yeah, I'm struck by your comments about starting your teaching in this context, right? The unideal context of Zoom, and yet in the long run, it's probably going to shape your pedagogy and even your thinking about your research in a way that's going to be productive for you, as opposed to us old timers who kind of have to relearn certain things now. This moment's going to be stamped on us for a long time, and I suspect it's going to really it's going to have a beneficial effect, even as unideal as it's been. So Sam, you've been working on race and public health for quite some time. Obviously, the pandemic has added I'm speaking for you right now, but I'll let you finish the thought. Of course, has added an enormous urgency to the work you've been doing. Going back to grad school, and I also want to talk about the podcast you and Mabel did last summer. We'll get to that later. But what are your thoughts in response to my initial question?
Yeah, I also, along with having my principal appointment being in the history department and also having an appointment in African American and African diaspora studies, I also have a joint appointment at the public health school in socio-medical sciences. So I do some teaching there. Some of that was certainly interrupted. But in terms of, the intellectual context, like trying to grip with this, it really, and this is a trite metaphor, which I think we've all, said and heard repeatedly, but very much like trying to drink water out of an open fire hydrant. Like there was so much going on so fast from day to day, week to week, that it was really hard to grapple. And at the onset of the pandemic, there was this moment where all of, we historians of medicine and public health and technology were trying to wrap our minds around it. And a lot of those discussions quickly went to the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. And I was a bit unsatisfied with that, with our kind of inability, I'm not going to say unwillingness, but inability to really think about this in terms of history of health inequities, and particularly when they were so patently obvious, by April, when there was those discussions about pre-existing conditions, for example, which, many of which are in elevated rates in Black communities, and there were no epidemiologists who had warned us about that. Certainly, the methodologies continued about genetic predisposition, and then as it looked like we were about to have a vaccine, they were already ginning up these narratives about vaccine hesitancy and Black medical mistrust. And I've never in 1 year been asked so many times about the Tuskegee experiment, as though that was the one bad thing to happen to Black people in a medical context, and as though it were the most recent, in fact. And and it was very much with a sense of frustration that I, would tell journalists, repeatedly, several times a week sometimes, that, quit thinking about Tuskegee. Like, these aren't legacies. These are actually things that happened today. And then Dr. Susan Moore died, and, but not before giving us that video, testimony about how she was treated. And and the narratives just kept coming. The mythologies just kept coming. We're still talking about vaccine hesitancy, even as the data shows that Black healthcare workers themselves, who you would think would be in the front of the line for vaccines, are actually being vaccinated at roughly half the rates in some states as their white colleagues. And that's not because of hesitancy at all. They have the same professional and intellectual background as their white colleagues. So in a lot of ways, it was frustrating to live in it, because, who, by the way, wants to be locked in their apartment, all day long for, going on 12 months now. But then also intellectually to have to, repeatedly see these mythologies, knowing that you, as a historian, as a scholar, you saw how that sausage was made a century ago, and knowing that, like, feeling almost helpless. And so one of the things I did was also run a research cluster in Columbia's Center for Science and Society, which is a wonderful group of colleagues and scholars. And so in the research cluster that I run, we started a documentation progress, which we just simply call Bearing Witness. And I probably should have committed the URL to memory, where we just basically just kept a timeline of all the events, the reports that were released, the incidents that dealt with health inequity and the pandemic just here in the United States. And we had like some 400 plus events, and we ended in late December just because I had to get back to my own work. But it's been very concerning, and I don't think it's over either. That's the other thing, that when we talk about the legacies of these things, I'm not quite sure what the policy legacies are. We focus very much on getting shots into arms, and understandably so, but I'm not sure that the legacy of this will be a sustained discussion of the structure, structural racism and the structure of health inequity. So I hate, as the last person speaking on this first question, I'm also the one to end it with a dour note, but I promise I'll pick my mood up before we, end this discussion. And thank you, by the way, Frank and Emma and Saida and the Department of History as well, for organizing this and having me on.
Dour notes are part of doing Black history. That's kind of how
it's supposed to be celebratory, more or less, right? Every February,
well,
so I should probably pick up my spirits. Yeah.
No. It's very hard to do that now. I mean, I think your discussion of the kind of all the mythologies, associated with, that inform medical racism, right, are just clear. And yet, in a moment when we're talking about systemic racism, right? I mean, when I hear your comments, it's like a disconnect between, the way in which we talk about the pandemic and the way this kind of meta category of, systemic racism that people are talking about now. Those things don't often intersect unless it's people like you and others who are forcing that intersection. So more to say about those matters later on. I want to kind of back up a little bit and ask JT and Madison a bit more about why go into history in the first place, right? I'm sure it has occurred to you, maybe it hasn't. And in this moment of crisis, why does history matter? Right. And not as why does history matter, but why devote your career or your life to actually the study and the production of historical knowledge? And so I'd love to get your thoughts about, in response to that question, given, the things too that we see in terms of, job shrinkage in academia, and then the issues that we were facing in the university setting that predated the pandemic, right? And yet you decided to commit yourselves to this work. So I'd like to start with JT.
In many ways, I think my sort of affinity for history starts with my pops, with my father. He was an organic historian, and like my father wasn't even fully capable of writing, but he could tell you the history of my hometown and that landscape from the top to the bottom. And so I think that's one influence. I also think at the University of Virginia, at the Woodson Institute at that time, now the chair of history at Virginia, Claudrena Harrell, was a really big influence for me. Professor Harrell does transformative work. She writes history, but also she has 3 books, edited volume, but also her kind of her work beyond the kind of discipline You know, I think her and Kevin Everson are experimental filmmaker and art professor there, like on their maybe their 10th or 11th film. And so that really, that capacity to use history and to do transformative work, I think those two routes help to explain why I chose history. I think that was a naive choice, I'll be honest. You know, my father was not a formal historian. Professor Harold, you know, taught us to read and look at everything and was making films and all that. And I thought I would step into graduate school and that would be my life. That was not the case. So I, you know, just the rigors of, you know, doing the work and trying to get the one project that you need to out. I think also, you know, I also came to, before coming to Columbia or going to Columbia, I started doing community organizing work. And I thought I was around a bunch of educators. Most of the people that I did organizing training with the Center for Third World Organizing with were teachers or ended up being teachers. And like, they were all into popular education. And that really, that year, the year in between undergrad and grad school, I went back home and I did adult education. And I saw history. My first history class was a Black cultural history class with Upward Bound at Rappahannock Community College. And so, and I still keep in touch with some of those students, right? And so I started to see that in order to have liberation, people had to be empowered through history. You know, I think not only for understanding practically, I'm thinking about the practical elements of history right now. I just finished Edward Onassi's Free the Land, and it feels acutely important that COINTELPRO happened. Like, we need to, you know, that's, you know, there's a practical element of it. But I also think history can enrich our imaginations for futures. I mean, my work is to think about how migrants rethought cities through these, what others just consider idiosyncratic, weird, odd institutions and spaces. But I think recovering those, it allows for the opening of new vistas on the future of places and futures outside of the kind of weary political drama of white supremacy and American politics.
Yeah, you know, JT, thank you for that. You know, I tell students, you know, like all the time, like a lot of times we, you know, like those who go into academia, we say, oh, I read this great book by this great historian or this great scholar. And it's often the case that our inspirations come from non-academic settings, particularly for Black historians, right? You know, whether it's your father or other folks who narrate and produce history in ways that are not legible, you know, or in a sort of in a kind of mainstream academic context. So I appreciate that intervention, as well as your history doing community organizing, which also involves a kind of community history work that's embedded in that work as well. Madison, why history? Why history for you?
I feel like I have to answer this question with a story, if that's okay. This could get long, but I'm going to try to keep it brief. I think that my experiences as an Afro-Southerner definitely pushed me towards history. You know, debates over the Civil War and Confederate memory, also cultural pathologies of Black people. I think when I look back, suffuse my daily life, especially interactions with family members and extended family. My father grew up Jim Crow, so his story certainly had an effect on me. But I think more than anything, an experience that I had during undergrad pushed me towards a history career. And it was a moment not unlike ours today with the resurgence of far-right white supremacist politics. I was a sophomore after the 2016 election, and I was working as a photojournalist for my student newspaper. And in April of 2017, white nationalist Richard Spencer held a rally on my school's campus at Auburn University. And so my coworkers and I, we found ourselves on the front lines of this conflict. And it was by no means on the scale of a Charlottesville and other things that happened in 2017. But for us, it was no less unsettling. And I believe that it was my experience documenting history as a photojournalist that, as well as having, you know, great and inspiring professors and teachers that drove me to want to study and write about history. And I wasn't interested in Southern history from the get-go, but I think it was something that developed over time. And I came to I wanted to understand how the idea of race came to be and how it structured people's lives. And I studied these blood quantum legalese in my senior thesis, and this sort of work in my undergrad led me to sources both literary and historical about people of mixed ancestry and free people of color. And I guess my research questions now, I sort of wondered why all the work had been concentrated on Southern port cities and urban areas. But overall, I think that what led me to Southern history was partly my anger and confusion about my childhood run-ins with family members over Confederate memory and slavery. But also, on the other hand, I think, like most people who study history, for me, it was a desire to know and understand the human condition. And I think that's a major thing that drives people towards this path.
Thanks, Madison. Yeah, it's funny because I hear in your answer, the particular conditions of 2016, 2017, right, that inspired you to go into the field of history as a career. And yet I hear there's also this transgenerational dynamic of confusion and anger that probably motivated all of us on this panel, I presume, at one point or another, and that driving our desire to do Black history, to look at the history of race and the ways in which it intersects with other dynamics in our society. So that's probably the reason why I started with the younger scholars on this group, because I wanted to hear how their experiences, are particular to our time, but also resonate, across time. I want to go back to this big question of Black history now, before we go down other rabbit holes in particular areas with respect to what you're all working on individually. So, I pose this question at the outset. At least it's burning for me, and if it's not for you, then you could take the question in any direction you'd like. Why is the study and teaching and promotion of Black history important right now? Those of us who do this all the time do Black history all the time, right? But is there something about this moment that allows for certain kinds of interventions? I'm kind of bringing together these two questions around how Black History Month used to be celebrated as a kind of a celebration of Black firsts, right? Of the contributions, the first person to do this, the first person to do that. The kind of Black first narratives are very much part of the way, at least I thought about Black History Month. And yet I wonder about those narratives now, their utility. Are they useful, or the way, is that still important? Or is it more important to really document and continue to call attention to the traumas and the exploitation and the brutality that we've seen in the past that has been revived in a lot of ways in recent years? So really the question is, why does Black History Month matter? Why does Black History Month matter now? And does our thinking about Black History Month change as a result of what's happened here? I'll let whoever wants to respond go first, and we'll just go in terms of who's inspired to go first, and then second, et cetera.
I know I know the tone of the question is not, do we choose one or the other? I would say, so I'm certainly not setting up that straw person, but certainly I would say to a certain degree both, right? I think all of us here are appropriately and rightfully critical of the kind of, of politics that is only representational without being substantial, which is to say, celebratory of, the first so-and-so, the first so-and-so. But at the same time, I also have come to understand, I believe, at least this is my current understanding, and those understandings change from year to year, that quite often the ideology that sits, the kind of topsoil of ideology that sits, atop the regolith of structural racism is really one of erasure, right? It's one of non-existence. And that could be in the historical canon, that could be in our daily social politics and our electoral politics, et cetera. And, I think there is something to be said about, a discourse that reminds the country itself that in a lot of ways, we as Black people have always been here and have done these things. Like, there's often, even in centrist to liberal discourses of inclusion, for example, like we should do more to bring Black people in, and I think that a lot of that narrative very dangerously, and I don't think unpurposefully, to be honest with you, elides the fact that, well, we've already been there. Actually, what we need to do is stop the exclusion, the constant efforts to push us out of spaces that we've inhabited before. And then once we get pushed out in one generation, erasing that history that we were ever there. So I kind of, this might be something that comes with advanced age where you kind of just become a little bit more conservative and you start to be more celebratory of the first. But I think in all seriousness, I think it's there, but not, I think there's an importance to it, but I don't think that, I certainly don't, and I don't think anybody else here on this panel would say so as well. I don't think it should come with the absence of an actual deep critique, a substantial critique, and a structural critique as well. And in fact, a lot of times the two are quite related. Like I said, that ideology of exclusion, of erasure, is the topsoil where on a bedrock of exclusion and of structural inequities.
I mean, I'll sort of maybe follow. Carter G. Woodson's such a fascinating figure, and I ended up including him in my book Negro Building, which is this examination of Black organized expositions, and which are directly connected to the museum movement. And Woodson actually is in Chicago in 1913 to actually sell basically wares. He's selling photographs of and engravings of people like Sojourner Truth and Booker T. Washington at a booth actually at an Emancipation Exposition in I think it was 1913. And that's where he sort of has this idea to organize the Association for the Study of Negro Life in history. And so those expositions were an effort to actually publicly cohere, like in the what I call the Black counter-public sphere, a sense of what was the Black contribution to America. It was a leveraging at the 50th anniversary of emancipation to say, are we not American? Basically, similar kind of argument to Douglass. And at the same time, Du Bois is organizing Emancipation Exposition for very similar reasons in New York in 1913, where he does his Spirit of Ethiopia performance, which is a kind of performative version of his book, The Negro. And again, sort of saying in that project, did not the Negro contribute to world history in a kind of Hegelian sense? And so there's a sense, I think, even in that moment in which, Woodson's formulating that he's leveraging it actually for political reasons, for civil rights, for human rights. And so it isn't just a celebration of great things, but it was trying to kind of leverage a certain space of a public sphere to engage in political action. And those expositions, Alain Locke does one in Atlantic City rather, and R.R. Wright Jr. is doing one in Philadelphia. And so they're trying to say, okay, here we are 50 years, where are we and why are we still not recognized as Americans? And so to me, it's a kind of always a gauge on the promise, right, of America, right? And what Black history tells us about the American project or the Enlightenment project more broadly.
Other thoughts?
I agree with both Sam and Mabel in relation to the kind of situatedness of that kind of. I think Black first can still be insurgent depending on the context, and I think I've been, and of course with the corollary that Black first can also be retrenchment and the kind of violent incorporation that Sam was mentioning. I'm thinking about this particularly with a growing public history project that we're doing through the Black Ecologies initiative in Virginia, out in Tappahannock through the Institute for Humanities Research. And they're very much in this phase, like, my hometown has very much been rocked by remove the monument kind of efforts and, pushing quite successfully to have that. A number of rallies, stuff that in my lifetime was not, I couldn't imagine, right? From my youth, and that has come with its own round of like Black first. And I think about Black business ownership, about Black presence. And I think that's really important in this moment. At the same time, trying to do critical environmental history in relation to Black communities there requires us to to use those kind of first as as touchstones and to work out from that. So I think about, particularly, I think about a Black resort that's getting a lot of circulation out there. It's a segregated Black resort. This man moves from Long Island, creates a Black resort in the 30s that lasts until the 70s. I think we could, as historians, it's our duty to pivot in and out of that kind of Black first narrative to think about, okay, well, these people were fishing. There's a whole other species life that was there, these archives have multiplicity is what I'm trying to say. And then we could continue, we can move through the kind of first insurgency to think about other forms of insurgency with those histories.
Yeah, I think I would just say to the question of why is it important to study this history year round, I think that the events from the past summer and the history behind them shocked a lot of people. But I think that shock in some ways speaks to how the narratives of American history that we're taught from a young age don't prepare us to understand the making of our times. A side note, I've been enjoying reading what historians have to say on Twitter about the current moment. And I picked up a lot of useful ideas as I've been wasting time scrolling. But I came across this quote by Eric Foner and Adam Rothman that said something to the effect of, the history that we're taught could not have produced the present that we're living in. And I was just like, yes. And I think about how things are changing now, but at least when I was growing up, the month of February and subjects like slavery and civil rights were the sole domains of Black history. And then the rest of American history and the rest of the year is history proper. And so I think that it's important to not only teach Black history year round, but also to change the way we write about and teach Black history at both the university and I think elementary, middle, and high school levels. I think sometimes combining Black history to a single month or particular moments in history, we run the risk of treating Black people as outside of history proper. But I would echo Professor Roberts saying that it's not an either or question, but we should still think critically about our politics. And to the question of the Black first narrative, I think JT's language of pivoting back and forth is really key. I wouldn't say that, I think that the Black first narrative is a helpful entry point for further conversation and thinking about integrating people into the traditional arc of American history. But I think as someone who's aspiring to do social history, the contributions of the collective are just as important and interesting as those of the individual figures. I think that the Black first narrative also has a dark side in serving as a kind of stand-in for progress. And what I mean by that is the forward march of Black first is definitely a sign of the times, but the first Black president, the first Black vice president is not a sign that American institutions are not deeply flawed and that there's still not inequality. It's no doubt important, but it's not an accurate gauge of where everybody else stands. I guess another critique I would say of that narrative would be that it's it can be a talented 10th or a great man way of thinking about history. The underlying premise being that the unique, successful vanguard of people are the ones who make history, the Frederick Douglasses or the Ida B. Wellses. But I think highlighting contributions to history, and this is where the pivoting back and forth idea that JT brought up, I found really useful. We can do this in a way that places the great people of history in a broader context that doesn't negate the doings of plain people.
No, I completely concur with all these comments. I asked it as a way for you to interrogate the either or nature of the question, and I have a number of thoughts triggered by your answers, and I want to improvise a little bit because I think part of what informed the question for me, and also in response to your reactions, is that what I've seen, at least in the historical profession, and then certainly in the public debates around U.S. history, certainly as they've been evolving. In recent years, and particularly as they evolved the 1619 project, is, I think in an academic context. So when I came along to study in grad school in the 1990s, the field of African-American history was established, right? This is not the Carter G. Woodson era at all, right? So you had a field, you could do a field in Black history at a PhD program, right? And, I came of an age where if you could kind of work in that realm, and that was sort of perceived as totally fine at the institutional level, right? And so it following along with the kind of the institutionalization of Black studies programs as it's continued in recent years, But what I do see happening now in the profession and in the bigger world beyond the profession is a resistance to the ways in which Black history allows us or encourages us or demands us to tell the story of the United States differently, right? And that requires you very into territory that had been dominated by white historians, right? I mean, I see this with the 1619 discussion, right? And so I'm just wondering if, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's inspired by your comments about that dynamic as we see in academia, but also in the public realm. When I think of Mabel's work on the built environment, I think all the debates around monuments, right, and the ways in which the work originating in Black history is forcing us to retell the story of this country in the West, period. And that is ruffling a lot of feathers now in ways that it may not have in previous years. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but that's just something I've been thinking about in response to what you were saying.
I think this isn't a full response, but I think certainly that points up what Madison just said about the hazards of contributionist history as well, because you could easily have a system in which many of the structural elements of white supremacy remain intact and still have a complete narrative about Black first, with completely absent a critique of white supremacy as a structural phenomenon. So I think that is the part that is one of the hazards, and that's where we see the limitations of contributionists. And I completely concur that to study Black history, and this is what our late colleague Manning Marable was all about, right? That's what IRIS now we have the institute and a full department in African American and African diaspora studies, but that was the vision that was brought to bear nearly 3 decades ago here at Columbia. Using Black history as a critical lens of thinking about, critiquing these other historical narratives that have been, if you did not have the benefit of being in a program where you could do a field in African American studies, or you did have that benefit, but you started to do 3 fields, in the other, in the kind of the regnant narratives, having a way in which you can disassemble some of these mythologies, and I think that's the continuing mission and urgent call of Black studies today, obviously. Yeah. I didn't intend that to be a mic drop, by the way. So if anyone can please.
Any other thoughts on my provocation following your comments? Okay. All right, well then let's just shift gears and let's talk a bit more about the specific work you folks have been doing. And I wanted to go to Sam and Mabel about the work that they did last summer, the podcast you did on Black lives in the era of COVID-19, which I see we were sort of touching on public facing work, public history work. I thought that series was excellent and urgent because it was an effort of documentation, right? In a moment in which we still did not know a lot about the pandemic, and I think it's made an important intervention. So I was wondering if Sam and Mabel could talk about that project and what they discovered and what they thought the contributions were of the project.
I'm going to let my colleague begin that off if she would like.
Yeah, I mean, I think it started in a sense, as a kind of response to, how do we start to make sense of this moment? And it was clear, we think about, in early April, where the numbers of who was dying from COVID became evident, and that is exactly when we get literally the backlash, right? This doesn't have anything to do with us. Let's open everything up, right? Or we could say it was a white lash. And it seemed important to really sort of try to make sense of that. And, we thought about doing, a syllabus, but then our colleague, Landra Nelson, did that amazing syllabus on COVID. And we just thought, well, a lot of what happened here in New York City, and there are stories to tell here. And so could we do something that started to become a kind of archive of understanding exactly what had gone on in this city since, it was just afterwards, right? In May, and try to sort of talk to people who were to some extent on the front lines. And so, we imagine that the series would function in that way, to tell the story of the city, particularly of the Black community, from multiple perspectives. So Sam, I don't know if you want to pick up.
Yeah, I also want to say, first of all, it was a thoroughly enjoyable process. I think, Mabel, this might have been our first collaboration, in fact.
Yeah.
So I'm really angry that we did not record our conversations like before and after these, because I mean, I really
With
enjoyed
Janine,
it.
they were great.
Yeah, we had a great team. I also do another podcast on race and harm reduction, drug policy and harm reduction, more contemporary and historical, where I would talk to people who are activists or who do, needle exchange or outreach to, HIV activists and HIV prevention educators. And so this was something that was, for me, easier to pivot. We used my producer and she helped with that. And as I recall these early conversations, Mabel, we had so many. One of the reasons why we thought this would be necessary is because of these narratives that were already emerging in April. And you all might remember, this was before, at the very beginning, where we all hit New York, and I think in many other cities, at 7 p.m. you would lean out your window and bang on your pots and pans, and it was a great thing for morale boosting, et cetera. And I'm not saying it was a bad thing at all, but quite often that narrative of frontline workers was about physicians and nurses, without any discussion that, within both of those, there are great hierarchies of privilege and inequality, professional inequality, without really acknowledgement that there are many people who work in front lines who don't work in healthcare, or first of all, who don't work in hospitals. So, for example, people who work in elderly care, people who work in home care, people who are radiologists, sonographers, who are not physicians, but and quite often, even within those institutions, weren't given PPE before doctors, until doctors and nurses had theirs. To say nothing of people who were daily, every hour exposed to the virus, and they're part of this economy of structural racism, structurally inequality, at least. And the narratives that we had at the time were not about that at all. There was no acknowledgement. It was very much almost a kind of double V campaign, really, for, as a historian, think of the double V campaign for World War II, victory in Europe and victory here. And we'll just kind of, suspend some of our critique of Jim Crow and, to use a statement from an earlier World War, close ranks. And it seemed, I think Mabel and I were very much concerned that this narrative could soon evolve to be a sacrificial one, where, we would be the most vulnerable, and to go without acknowledgement of how that vulnerability was set in motion. So we had a number of people from public thinkers to people who work in the front lines, and I don't think there was really, and not to brag about, but I don't think there was really anything else like it. I don't know if you've seen anything, Mabel, but it, the kind of where we had just a singular focus on it was called Black Lives in the Era of COVID-19. And so I'm very proud of that work, and I really enjoyed it. And I think Mabel and I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago where she's thinking about bringing the band back together, so to speak. And so we have a short list of people we might interview later on this season. So.
Yeah, the reason why I asked about it is that it's just an example of kind of the ways in which urgent, I mean, you had the resources to put it together and the experience, but the urgency and the ability to pivot, to use the term, a word that JT mentioned, or used earlier, into action. I thought was really timely and important. I mean, the episode I recall is the one with Trammell Thompson, the MTA subway conductor, right? One of the things that strikes me as a New Yorker who's born and raised here are the ways in which, where do you see Black folk in the political economy? You see them on the subways as workers, right? Or as healthcare workers, right? And in elder care, the realms that you mentioned, Sam. So the ability to kind of bring those stories out in the moment, I think is important. I've been trying to encourage students that if you want to look at Black New York, look at the people in these realms, right? Because just walk down to who are the people working at the hospital right down the street, from Columbia, right? They're usually people of color, women of color especially, right? And so for your ability to call attention to that in that moment of crisis, I thought was extraordinary. I mean, it's my way of congratulating you, but also just to give it to the people an example of the kind of work that can be done in this moment.
Mm-hmm. And that was also part of when we saw Elmhurst and Corona, Queens as being quote unquote the epicenter of the epicenter. And that a lot of that had everything to do with how we structure healthcare. I don't think it was very much of a coincidence that those two neighborhoods have, I believe, the highest in the city, if not certainly very high, proportion of healthcare workers who aren't in the elite strata of healthcare, meaning your physicians, your anesthesiologists, your surgeons, and your elite nurses, your RNs. And many of them were there on those front lines, and literally put their lives on the lines for that. And we were able to interview Saida Dunstan, who is the executive director of Elm Corps in Queens, which is a community organization begun by Black Panthers in 1965. And she gave us one of the best analyses of COVID that I think I had heard all year, along with Thompson, who very much reminded me of Hubert Harrison, by the way. This organic intellectual labor leader.
Totally organic intellectual,
yeah. And I'm just sitting here feverishly writing notes that as though I'm in a graduate seminar, because this was, I had read or thought of nothing more incisive than the critiques that some of those guests brought to bear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's important. I hired someone to produce actually a map that overlaid the COVID deaths in that part of the city over a redlining map. And it's actually it's the book flaps for the catalog for the Reconstruction show. And it shows the persistence, right, of that divestment, right? And that it completely maps on. Grade D is exactly where you had the highest concentrations of death.
And two maps separated by decades too.
Yeah.
Not, right. Yeah, that's the really startling thing.
Yeah.
JT, you mentioned earlier, I'm skipping around a little bit, and those folks who want to post questions can do so. There's been a couple of things in the chat that folks could look at, but I have plenty more questions to ask. What I hear in your work, JT, having not read too much of it, yet, is your attention to environmental racism, and then Black understandings of the environment, right? And so I was wondering if you could talk about how those things came together in the Black Ecologies project, which you mentioned earlier, or in anything else that you're working on right now.
Yeah, I think the environment, COVID is also environmental, right? Both in terms of where we could think about the impact of, oil processing, asthma, and those kinds of direct associations between the environment and death in relation to Black communities and COVID, but also the kind of, the larger geography of COVID, forest clearing, all of that. And so I think, and global chains of supply, and I think in their integration. So I think I've been thinking about the environment since high school in some capacity, but I think even more so recently, I just see it as the kind of, and I think I see it as a kind of central, very important central question that we all have to think about. And I think Black communities are, of course, victims of climate change and that kind of the ways that is unequally born again, on different communities, born out in different communities, and also toxic dumping and violent extractionism. But I also think Black communities have unique epistemologies when it comes to environmental, not only catastrophe, but also futures. And so I think in my work, I really think about, in the first project, I really think about how these kinds of other ways of looking at the water and the landscapes that emerge in plantation and post-plantation Upper South communities, like how that gives expression to a Black commons, right? How that gives expression to a fleeting, often fleeting and fugitive vision that centralizes use value and other kinds of modes of engagement that's not about exploitation. And I think genocide and ecocide go hand in hand, right? And so I think that's the kind of, I think following that forward and thinking about the ways that plantations, plantation relations continue to govern Black life, not only through labor, but also in all the kinds of realms of social reproduction and housing, et cetera, that also plot in the Black commons go forward. And I think I've been increasingly pivoting back to rural Southern communities in Virginia to think about the environment very pressingly, because my hometown is supposed to be underwater, right? It's existential in these kind of large ways, but also like in a very pressing way, like the landscape that I know as home is not necessarily going to be there. And I think also I've been directly partnering with my colleague Justin Holsby at Emory on this work. And we met, I'll say this note for graduate students, we met through my own market failure. We'll just keep it moving. But we met, he was a graduate student, I didn't get the job, but that shows you that Black history and Black studies is more than the kind of institutional space that it is. Like we can build outside of and within those frameworks. So Justin and I think we have a forthcoming piece in Southern cultures. And I think that's the first time that I really realized the ways that Katrina has shaped both of our trajectories. I think, you know, him directly, he's thinking about post-Katrina New Orleans and geographies and schools. But for me, it was at UVA, and again, going back to Claudrina Harrell, you know, she brought Raheem Islam to think about what was going on with collectives in New Orleans after Katrina. I think ever since then, I've been, you know, in some ways trying to get to geography, ecology, and that kind of space. And I think in the moment of COVID, in the moment of ongoing urban displacement, that is particularly it's particularly necessary as well in the context of kind of post-oil, our post-oil moment, so.
You know, I wanted to go to Mabel, but given what JT's saying here, Madison, I just wanted to know if you have any thoughts about how you see your own work rethinking our understanding of the South, your understanding of the South, right? I mean, I hear that so much in what JT's talking about, right? And given your own research interests, I wonder if you had some thoughts along those lines.
Yeah, definitely. I think where to begin is a first question for me, but I think obviously everything's kind of a work in progress to me, and I think my answer to this could be different a week from now if you ask me. But I think part of a reason why I want to study Southern history is it's important to think about African Americans as equal contributors to the culture of the South, and I think that is, in one part, what led me to my topic of free people of color, especially in rural regions. I mean, a lot of the research concentrates on New Orleans and Charleston and Mobile and these urban areas. And there's a reason why there's less research on free people of color in rural areas. Smaller demographically, but also they were not as highly concentrated, more scattered communities. And when I think about, you know, the so what behind this research, I think the first thing that comes to mind is because they were there. You know, the presence is important in and of itself to me. And you know, the people that I study are a byproduct of the laws governing slavery and freedom, and and thinking about the way that their lives were structured by the threat of enslavement, and the circumcised sense of freedom is important to me. And I think that understanding their sense of place and how they fashion a life for themselves is important for our understanding of the antebellum world as a whole. And so I think that that's kind of my current why for what I study. But I'd also like to do in the future more theoretical work on racism and race, and how we might go about studying racial categories as products of history and, you know, could continually remade rather than these transhistorical categories. A literary work that was really informative for me was Charles Chestnut's "What is a Black Man?" essay. And I think that question drives a lot of my research interests, trying to figure out what is a Black man, or what is being a Black person mean across time and place. And I think asking ourselves the question in our own research, what is a Black man or Black woman or a Black person, will force us to ground these experiences of being identified as Black or identifying as Black in a set of historically specific circumstances. And so I think, yeah, I think that thinking about racism and people's experience of it in the past is important to me, but also think it's useful for thinking about today as well.
Thanks, Madison. Yeah, and as I heard you talk, and JT, of course, I thought of Mabel's work, not just in Virginia, but just around, the race and the built environment. And I'm thinking about the bigger discussion, debate, struggles around monuments, speaking of the South and long reach of the South, through the attention and the struggles to take down many Confederate white supremacist monuments that reach up to our world here in New York City and even our campus. So maybe I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you're intervening in these discussions. I'm thinking about the work you've been doing on building. I've seen you talk about on building. I think it's Building Race and Nation is the project, and how you see your work intervening in our thinking about monumentality, how it can be reimagined, how do we adequately interrogate the racist histories behind them.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. And I, that project Building Race and Nation is exactly the question that Madison just asked. Like what, asking like what is the origins of Blackness? And I had been obsessed. Du Bois commissioned an architect, Werner Tanny, to build what he called the Temple of Beauty at this exposition, and he does it in this neo-Egyptian Nubian aesthetic, right? I mean, a complete like a Black aesthetic around a Black nationalist project. And it was like, well, why is American national architecture, Greco-Roman, and so I wanted to sort of understand that formation, right? And so how the formation of racial difference, and the construction of literally the architecture of the nation are running parallel. And the perfect person that intersects that is Thomas Jefferson, right? Because he's both a statesman, and he's a plantation owner, right? And enslaver, and sort of trying to use the built environment as a lens to try to understand that was the project. But what was interesting, and this gets back to maybe JT's point, is that as I started to develop the project, I started to, because I was interested in, well, why was enslaved labor used to build these monuments to freedom? Like, what was the origins of that disavowal? How are those two things kind of operating simultaneously? And in looking at these kinds of labor practices, right, of how enslaved people were put to work in places like UVA, you also start to get into the question of property, how the land was in fact acquired from indigenous. So it got me to also think about dispossession, and that became a larger part. So trying to read the formation of racial difference, where whiteness stands for America in relationship to this constant dispossession of the land by white settler colonialism and the sort of domination, right, of the Negro, right, the Africans that become the enslaved population, as a means of extracting labor and also wealth in from that condition. And that then becomes the thing in which a city like Washington, D.C. is literally built on, right? And you see the sort of irrational, the inability to sort of reconcile that and what just happened January 6th. It's all there, and history can show us that if we look through this with a Black historical framework.
As you were talking, January 6th just came right to mind. Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's really fascinating work, and I think a number of us have talked about this, like the attention to history now in the public realm. It's unlike other moments, at least in my lifetime. Which gives us potential for interventions like the ones.
Yeah, and can I just add a point there? People were all up in arms about a Confederate flag being, sort of paraded through. But wait a minute, there are literally statues to Confederate generals, in the Capitol. Like that wasn't, the Confederate was always there. And I don't call them Confederate monuments. I call these are monuments made by Americans, and these are American values. The CSA failed. So who put up these those were Americans who did that work. And so let's not forget that.
Absolutely. I have a question for Sam, but I see some questions in the Q&A that I'd like to pose to the panelists. I have one here talking about the future of Black history. It's a question to the panelists. Anybody could take it. How do you see the future of Black history in terms of the profession? Where do you see the field going? What are some historians who are doing the exciting work right now that you find challenging and or exciting? Anybody can take the question. Anybody's.
I learned a while ago not to answer the question about the future of Black history. It has too many futures to be speaking about any particular one. So I will
I'd
demur
love
on
to hear
that.
what Madison's thinking, like how she's thinking about her work.
Please.
I just recently read Jessica Marie Johnson's Wicked Flesh for a class, and in bringing in another problem, but also one of these double-sided problems / good things about in terms of Black history, thinking about the resistance narrative and questions of agency. There's this debate that's been happening in the last 20 years about the idea of agency and sort of the way that some studies can treat Black figures as suffering incarnate. But I think that what Jessica Marie Johnson does very well is showing how Black people's lives were marked by pleasure and joy, as well as mundanity, not simply, but as well as suffering and resistance. So I think that her work is really exciting.
JT or others?
I'm kind of with Sam and not wanting to say anything too quickly about what the future is. I'm excited about what's going on at the intersection of geographies and ecologies and Black history. I'm also definitely really excited about some of the stuff that's going on, like Madison mentioned, Jessica's work, but Black queer histories and all of that. I think that's changing some stuff up. And I think, so I don't have a kind of very prescriptive thing, but I think I think that, what Mabel was saying earlier about Woodson and the kind of, that moment, I think that kind of problem space constantly changes. And so I think, Black history, the future of Black history is one of adaptation to, the pressing needs of Black communities and also what's going on, globally and in the context of the US that we're talking about here. I think I want to go back to this notion of pivoting and being flexible. I think and I think that's why the kind of queer stuff, the queer histories are so significant, because they're not just adding queer folks to well-worn histories, they changing things up. So
yeah, no, well said. The interventions that are changing are thinking about the field, not just adding and stirring, right? No, I think that's well said. Sam, there's other questions here, but I want to get to Sam. Let's think about exciting work. I think about Sam's work. We talked about your work, your public-facing work you did with Mabel, but I wanted to ask you more about some of the work you've been doing yourself, right? And I'm characterizing it. If I'm mischaracterizing it, please correct me. I see you as somebody who's been looking at questions of race and public health for a long time, with an attention to carcerality, right, which is certainly a booming part of U.S. history and Black history. And I had a particular question for you about harm reduction. I've heard you talk about your work on harm reduction, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a bit and how you see yourself making the interventions that you want to make with the current work you've been doing.
Yeah, I think, thank you for that, and I'll keep it quick because I know there are other questions that we wanted to answer, but one of the projects that I'm working on is about, as kind of alluding to one of my earlier responses, about reclaiming space that we've always inhabited. And so harm reduction is, generally speaking, this philosophy of being anti-criminalization of certain behaviors, particularly use of drugs, sex work, a wide range of things that typically fall on our communities hardest. But quite often the narratives as they've been told have been ones that have been about kind of white leadership and white guidance and white formation of this movement. And so I've spent a number of the past few years speaking with and really getting my own intellectual guidance really from people who were Black and Latinx who were working in this movement since the 1980s and using it in different ways, not just thinking about reduction of harm, but also as a structural critique of why we have certain types of drug prohibition in the first place. Why was it that, crack cocaine, for example, had the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity? That was not an accident. And many of these activists knew it, even if some of their counterparts might not have, and certainly if the wider public did not either. So for me, it's a way really of thinking critically about how the health effects of racism actually permeate all of our existence on a number of scales and a number of levels as well. I don't know, it really, it's very challenging. It's taken a lot for me to think think my way through it, because it's not a very easy history to hold in one's mind, particularly in a contemporary moment where this is a history unfolding as well. So maybe I think that is actually, I don't want to speak about the future, I'll speak of a future. And I'd like to think that there's ways in which we use thinking about health politics, bodily politics, as a way of thinking about not just our history, rewriting some of those histories, and also thinking about where the future of our politics goes, I think is something that's very promising. It's something to which I've devoted quite a bit of my energies of late.
Thank you. Fascinating stuff. So
Thank
Black
you.
History Month was fundamentally a pedagogical project. We haven't, spent sustained time talking about pedagogy, but there's a question in the chat right here. If anyone on the panel, or in the Q&A, I'm sorry, anyone on the panel have any thoughts about translating all of these thoughts to teaching, both in history and other social science fields? A number of you are working in, across fields, even if you're anchored in the discipline of history or as a cultural historian, or intersecting with architecture. I wonder if you had some thoughts about how you translate the work you're doing into the pedagogy you do in the classroom or other realms.
I think we might have steered clear of pedagogy because pedagogy has been so difficult this past year. Teaching on Zoom is, I'm grateful for the opportunity to teach anywhere and anytime, but this has been very challenging. But I'll say for me, I every year I have my kind of flagship lecture course in health and inequality, and we cover about 100. We do from late 19th century to HIV/AIDS and environmental justice politics. Like it's a whirlwind tour of about 125 years, and a lot of that had to be readjusted in light of the pandemic. And I'm not in the ways that I rethought that course. I'm not sure I go back to where I used to teach it. In a lot of ways, that course, as I've taught it before, was preparing to think about this moment. I didn't predict. I'm not Nostradamus or anything. I didn't predict a pandemic necessarily, but I've always been aware of the kind of fraying infrastructure of health, and particularly how we're at the most vulnerable end of that, or our fraying infrastructure of our health politics. But certainly trying to teach in that context, teaching history when the present moment was so fearful and distracting. I'm not sure how I go back or if I want to go back. I think there's ways I'm gonna have to rethink that. And I think that speaks to, as we've said, things that JT and Madison have said, that we've all discussed here, that there's a certain type of way in which being in Black studies is being called to be at once not presentist, but also being present at the same time. And I think in this context, I don't think my experience is any different from the ways that a lot of us teach in different moments as well.
Something that I have been thinking about, and I think that this comment is kind of expressing my fears about teaching as much as it's expressing a way of going about pedagogy. And this is sort of drawing on Professor Roberts' comments earlier about disassembling methodologies and deconstructing the categories we currently use to study history. It seems like it's not just the information that we present to students, but also the questions that we ask them for discussion. For me, one of the first questions I asked my students, and that Professor Fields has us ask, is what is the South? And a lot of the answers that I got were treating the South as the sole domain of everything that's wrong with America. And so for me, as someone who studies Black Southerners and someone who's a Black Southerner herself, deconstructing that is something that's important to me. But, it seems like you can throw or my fear is that you can throw all the facts and information you want to students, but if you don't ask them questions that allow them to either elaborate on a new interpretation or prompt them to reinterpret material, they may just incorporate new information into previously held frameworks. So I think that it's not a direct way of answering that question, but I think, especially when teaching African-American history, it's important to denaturalize previously held assumptions about the way history works, and also helping students realize that they too are historical subjects, I think is important too.
Other thoughts on pedagogy?
I'm currently on the Schomburg, so take this with a grain of salt that I'm not actually in the classroom. So I think for me, as I was talking about earlier, I think we can continue to use the classroom as a space for thinking history in a kind of insurgent way. One of the things that I really found quite useful in the spring when I was teaching under this condition is to still hold on to collectivity and to really have students have to think in relation to one another about, you know, particularly it was my Black feminisms class, which I taught from a kind of Black eco-feminist kind of perspective, and that kind of shaped what we read. You know, we were originally up trying to do a zine. And so, you know, I wanted folks to like, the zine is a kind of insurgent form. It's like, you can chop together stuff. You can, you know, it's self-published. It doesn't have to be like, it could be very rigorous without having been published by, you know, an academic press. And what that didn't work, obviously. We weren't in together, and so we couldn't meet in the same kinds of ways. And so it became a more open cultural sort of production, and like allowing students to really take the question of Black history to their particular interests and concerns was really significant. And so like, you know, one of my students, you know, produced a blues song with environmental themes. Like, I mean, like, no, like a music student, like, like an actual production. I was like, you know, and so I think we can empower. I think everybody needs Black history, insurgent Black histories. We all need them. We need to be thinking about them in every realm. If we're, you know, if we're in corporate spaces or we're in organizing spaces, we need to know insurgent Black histories. And so I think the classroom is one of those sites. And I think we can, again, empower students to understand history, not just as the reproduction of history for knowledge and history's sake, as the only domain of history, but one that they could do real insurgent cultural work in the current moment.
Yeah, I love the term, insurgent Black history. Black history should be insurgent by definition. And I completely agree with you, Sam. I mean, on the one hand, Zoom teaching is utterly unideal. But, you know, what has happened since the pandemic is that the classroom has really expanded. I mean, Zoom allows us to engage in ways like this, sometimes where we don't even do in our hallways at Fairweather Hall. And I have found that I have learned a lot of Black history and Black public history work as a result of what we've seen here through this forum, as unideal as it is, you know. So, and that's been exciting for me, you know, around the work that I do on sport and activism, and so in that sense, it's been exciting, even though this has been a terrifying experience and an unideal one for most of us doing this work. So we're kind of up against time. And do any folks have any closing thoughts or anything burning that we didn't get to that I didn't have the foresight to ask you?
I would say thank you, Frank, for your expert stewardship over this discussion. I've immensely enjoyed it. It's a perfect way to end the day. So yeah, thank you so much.
You know, agreed. Thank you. This has been a really great conversation. Lots of links. You know, put a lot of stuff in my online to look up. So yeah, thank you.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you, JT. So thank you, JT. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Mabel. Thank you, Madison, for giving us your time, your expertise, and for sharing with us your inspiring work. I look forward to seeing more of it. I know I will in the coming months and years. And also to thank again Emma and Saida for bringing us together, and for again engaging in ways that, you know, we didn't do enough before the pandemic, at least. So especially across generations. You know, one of the things that I think Saida and Emma have done really well is bringing in diverse voices that we sometimes don't see together in person. So it's been wonderful to experience that yet again with this session. So thank you all. Thank you.
And thank you to Saida and to Emma as well too, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you to Frank for being so generous with his time and accepting our invitation to moderate. He's been such a big part of getting this panel off the ground and being a good resource. So thank you, Frank, and thank you all for being here. Really, really wonderful conversation. And this is recorded, so there is a link that will be available. The YouTube link, it's still going to be there, all the links on Facebook without going anywhere, and we'll be sharing all of the links that were shared in the chat as well. And I'll send out a document.
Fantastic. Be well, everybody.
Until next time.
Stay tuned for the next panel. It will be next month.